Hey guys, and welcome back to yet another GCSE revision video. Now, myself and Mr. Sally's will be going over Macbeth, which is part of your upcoming Literature Paper 1 exams in May, and this is just around the corner. So with these exams just around the corner, what Mr. Sally's and I will be doing when it comes to your Macbeth exams is going over what we think will come up in this year's exams by firstly looking at a pattern and the trend of previous exam papers, and of course making our own predictions. And by the way guys, remember that if you are stressing about Macbeth and you're like, oh, I really want to see how to write model answers for some of these questions, don't forget that I will be running a one-off Easter GCSE literature masterclass on Macbeth on the 7th of April all the way to the 13th, so make sure you join in. So let's get to it. Let's talk about Macbeth 2025 exams edition and what our predictions are. Now when it comes to Macbeth, okay, so let's start with 2024, because the best way to make predictions is to look at past questions and see maybe if there's a trend and there's a pattern. And obviously, as you can see behind us guys, we've literally laid out all the past questions from 2024 all the way to 2017, and what we're going to be doing is obviously walking you guys through if these questions did make a reappearance, what you can talk about, and also some of the common issues and mistakes that students have made in past years when answering these questions. So let's start with the 2024 exam, right? What came up?
So 2024 was Lady Macbeth, but not just Lady Macbeth. Look at the way the question is phrased. Lady Macbeth as a strong female character. And this is the way of the examiners asking you to think about Shakespeare's purpose. So Lady Macbeth isn't just this person he's describing, she represents something in that society. So this is a barrier that many students don't realise is there. If you just write about the character, it's hard to get above a grade 6. You've got to think about the character as a construct, something that the author has created in order to deliver a point of view. So, what is Shakespeare's point of view of women? That's why the examiners have included the word female character. And what is his point of view about strong women? Remember, this is a patriarchal society, and you've got to think about, well, what happens to Lady Macbeth? She gets killed, and she's automatically assumed to be worse than Macbeth because she suffers much more guilt than him. She's the one who gets the blame for persuading him to do the murder. Is that fair? And once you start dealing with those ideas, it's almost impossible not to get at least a grade 7.
Okay, so would you say therefore that this question was definitely, you have to not only talk about Lady Macbeth, but also the idea of female characters, i.e. the theme to do with gender?
Yes. I mean, you didn't have to. You could be happy with a grade 6 and not do that. But once you started dealing with those themes,
that's how you start moving up to 7, 8 and 9.
Yeah.
Great. Now, when it came to the 2023 exam, this question was centered around how Macbeth is presented as a male character who changes. And to be honest, the advice in terms of approaching that question is literally the flip side of what Mr. Sally's has talked about, right? Whilst with the 2024 question, you have to engage with how Lady Macbeth is presented. With this question, it's how Macbeth is shown, but you want to not only talk about how he's presented as a patriarchal male character who actually initially goes against Jacobean expectations of men at the time, because he actually saw his wife as an equal, a confidant, before that shifted. But also this question, and where a lot of students went wrong with answering this question, is not contrasting his changes enough.
Yes, and if you think about the changes in a character, that shows the author's ideas. So focusing on the changes is just such an easy way to get top marks.
Yes.
2022, Macbeth's fears. So this is a Macbeth question. It's really hard to think, oh, what is the author's purpose here? You know, he's just afraid. And so it's really easy to lose marks on a question like this just by answering what the question asks you. I think a question like this is a bit unfair because the mark scheme wants you to deal with Shakespeare's ideas, and here the question doesn't ask you to do that. That's a barrier. And so you've got to go in and think, no matter what the question, I've got to get Shakespeare's ideas in. Why does he want to show Macbeth is scared? Oh, because that's his punishment for committing regicide. why does he want to show that regicide will stop you enjoying being a king? Oh, because he wants to show all the nobles that you shouldn't try and get rid of King James, because even if you succeed, your life will be ruined. It's a political message. So that's the way to always get the top marks. What is Shakespeare's purpose?
Okay, and then the 2021 question was to do with the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. This was a complete character question, but students had to talk about both main characters, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And one of the things, again, guys, remember that when you're answering your Macbeth questions, and again, this is what I'm going to be going over in my Macbeth GCSE Masterclass on the 7th of April during Easter. You don't want to get into describing, oh, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, they're really close. You know, they seem to be such a close husband and wife. It's not about that. You don't need to describe what's going on between the relationship. You want to talk about how it is presented as, Mr. Sally says, a construct, a social construct. How does it go against Jacobean expectations? Remember that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth see each other as equals, as partners, and actually Lady Macbeth is presented as a more dominant character. But equally with this question, and again, this is now what distinguished students that got 5s, 4s, and maybe even 3s from those that started hitting 6s, 7s, 8s, and 9s, is also contrasting the shift in their relationship by the time the play got to Act 5, where we can see that they initially shared a very close bond, and that becomes completely distant as a result of Macbeth's ambition. Okay, so again, guys, if you're like, okay, this is helpful, it's great to know these tips, but how does that look like in an essay? I'm literally going to be writing a model answer that you can use to revise, in addition to obviously getting the lesson that you can use to revise from over and over again in the final 4 weeks to the Macbeth exams. And this is going to be in Easter time on the 7th. I'm going to be running that one-off class before the final GCSE exams. So what came up with the 2019 or even the 2020 question?
Yeah. So again, we've got the Lady Macbeth question being reused, but this time she's still a female character, but now it's a character who changes rather than being a strong female character. When you get a question about the changes, it's a gift, because as soon as you see a change, you can think, well, why did Shakespeare make her change in that way? Why did she seem so courageous when they were planning the murder, unafraid of the blood all over Duncan, and then suddenly she's racked by guilt so much that she commits suicide? What accounts for that change? And once you start thinking about Shakespeare's purpose, it's easy to explain the change. He wants to show that women are weaker. He wants to show that she is deservedly punished, like Eve in the Garden of Eden story, for tempting Adam, just like she tempted Macbeth. And so it's easy then to get into the top grades. There is a danger with starting with the extract, because it's really difficult when you get the extract to think, well, how's the character changing? Because you might have the extract from the beginning, from the middle. And I recommend experimenting with actually talking about the changes in the character and then putting the extract in where that appears in those changes. You don't have to do that, you can start with the extract.
Okay. So when it comes to the 2019 question, this question now flipped back to Macbeth. How is he presented as a violent character? It was a captain's speech where he was like, brave Macbeth, well, he deserves that name. And we get this really blood-filled description of how he, fought in the war and so on. Now, remember, the first thing that you want to consider is when it comes to this thematic aspect of violence. Violence is treated in a completely different way in Jacobean society to how we see it today, right? It's not seen as a positive trait. Whilst in Jacobean society, if it was in service to one's country, to one's king, it was actually a very masculine and very noble trait. And this question required students not only show an awareness of that, because obviously that's great AO3 points, but equally contrast. Okay, so I'm always going to be talking about this. And again, in my Macbeth upcoming Easter GCSE Masterclass, I always talk about contrast, contrasting how it's used in the beginning versus the end. How does Macbeth use this violence initially in service to his country, which therefore presents him as quite noble, a tragic hero, and how he actually then devolves again through the same violence, but this is now turned against his own country. It's turned against his king. He violates divine right of kings by killing King Duncan, but of course also the more his paranoia overwhelms him, the more violent he becomes, and ultimately he then becomes a tyrant. Once more, guys, remember that this is how you need to be answering your Macbeth questions, showing contrast and also showing this shift, okay? Always talking about what's happening at the start versus the end. That's what gets you those marks. And most importantly, making it attached to, for example, what ideas contextually was Shakespeare trying to demonstrate. Now for the 2018 question, what came up?
So, a brilliant segue, because it is another contrast. The attitudes of Macbeth and Banquo to the supernatural. This is quite a difficult question, and I don't think we'll get one that's as cool as this, because it forces you to get top grades. The contrast between Macbeth and Banquo to the supernatural is obvious. Macbeth is immediately propelled down an evil path, whereas Banquo resists. And so we've got to ask, why does Shakespeare make Banquo resist and Macbeth not? Well, that's really interesting, because in the historical Holinshed Chronicles that Shakespeare went to, Banquo actually helps Macbeth to kill Duncan. Like, that's the historical fact. And Macbeth reigns for ages. Like, there's no tragedy at all. But Shakespeare's point is, no, King James is supposed to be descended from Banquo, so Banquo has to be a noble figure who resists evil and is not persuaded by the supernatural to become violent and to participate in regicide. So it's easy then to contrast these two figures and say why Shakespeare has done it. Then obviously the supernatural leads you into all this discussion about what Jacobeans believed at the time, King James's belief in witchcraft. It's just a gift of a question. Sadly, I don't think we're going to get it again, but it would be lovely. What was the 2017 question?
So obviously this is the first question with the new 9-to-1 grading system. That's why we've obviously stopped at 2017. And this question was a complete theme question. It was to do with how ambition is presented in Macbeth. Now with this question, because it's a complete theme question, you actually had, if you were answering something like this, you have a bit more flexibility, room for maneuver. What I mean by that is you're not constrained to only talking about one character. Of course, you want to talk about how ambition is presented through both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Remember, Shakespeare's message is ambition is not a good thing, okay? So always remember that. Even if, again, today, in modern day, we always see ambition and wanting to get more than what you're born with or what you currently have as actually something that's great, it's aspirational. In Shakespeare's time, that actually threatened the social order. So of course in Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's character, ambition is presented as a corrupting theme. But of course with this question, in terms of how ambition is presented, you could also contrast both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's ambitious characters to people like Banquo and Macduff. Banquo is told that his kids will be kings. He never does anything about it. He just decides, I'm going to let fate take its course, but I'm not going to try and rise above the social hierarchy. Same to Macduff. He kills Macbeth, but rather than taking the crown for himself and displaying ambition, he then gives it back over to Malcolm. Okay, so you want to, with this type of question, if you did get just a sole theme question, you have lots of flexibility, and I think this kind of question would be amazing in terms of just giving you room to not only talk about Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, but also how some of the other characters display ambition. Now, of course, prediction time.
It is, yeah.
And when it comes to the 2025 exams, and this is why we like doing this every single year when we're doing our predictions, laying out the past questions, just to see if there's a trend, right? And from at least what I can see here, the trend largely is very character driven.
Yeah.
And, you know, it seems like AQA has basically, you know, kind of flipped between Lady Macbeth, then Macbeth, Macbeth, then both of them, then Lady Macbeth, 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 and this was the only question that was purely theme-based.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, in terms of your predictions, what do you think, if we look at this trend, what do you think would potentially be worth students considering?
Okay.
In terms of the 2025 exams?
So, it's quite horrible actually looking at this, because part of me thinks AQA has just lost its bottle. They used to ask complex questions, and now they've tried to make the questions as easy as possible, going with single characters. And then they thought, oh no, we can't do that, because if we just focus on the character, our top students aren't going to get top grades easily. And so we try to link them to a theme. And so this is the way I think it'll go. I think the theme will be guilt, but you won't just get that on its own. It might ask you about Lady Macbeth and Macbeth as a contrast for the guilt, or they might just focus on Macbeth's guilt. But I'm going with guilt as my main thing, and if it was just a character, then obviously it looks like Macbeth's next, doesn't it? Yeah. What do you think?
So you've kind of stolen my prediction.
Oh no! I'll give you another prediction.
Go on.
So my other prediction, which is the same prediction I made last year, is the supernatural. And last year, when I did my prediction video, I showed how, or what would happen if the supernatural doesn't come up and it's Macbeth or it's Lady Macbeth. And people who stuck to the end of the video got the answer to the actual question that came up. So I want to say the supernatural as well. I just don't know if AQA's got the bottle to do it. I wish they would.
Okay. Well, my prediction, and I'm going to be going over this again in my Macbeth Masterclass and showing my students if my prediction comes true, this is what you write about, in addition to obviously going over a past question. We're looking at the 2022 because we've already looked in past GCSE Masterclasses at model answers for the 2024 and 2023 exam. My prediction is I think it's going to be, and I'm going to be a little bit conservative here, okay? Because in the past I've kind of, given a bit of crazy predictions, but this year I'm going to be conservative. Given obviously you can see lots of Macbeth, I think Macbeth is definitely a question and a character to watch out for. He seems quite popular in terms of how frequently he appears, okay? And so I personally think that it will be a Macbeth question, and actually tied to Mr. Saleh's prediction, one of his hallucinations might be used. So how is Macbeth's guilt portrayed, right? Remember, by the way, that Macbeth obviously has the floating dagger hallucination, and of course sees Banquo's ghost, okay? Remember that there's only 3 hallucinations: the floating dagger, Banquo's ghost, and the spots of blood that Lady Macbeth sees. I think a Macbeth question is going to come up, and if we then became more specific, perhaps how Macbeth's guilt is presented. I also want to say that in terms of a theme, I think maybe ambition may potentially make a reappearance, right? And of course, if ambition comes up just as a theme question, I don't think it seems highly likely. I think they've all been very, very character focused in more recent years. But if you've got an ambition question, you could go to town and talk in terms of talking about how ambition is shown as corrupting. You talk about Macbeth, you talk about Lady Macbeth, you contrast them with Banquo, contrast them with Macduff. There's so much you can do, okay? But that's my more kind of a little bit out there prediction, okay? So I do think that Macbeth is probably going to come up, and I actually think that guilt would be a nice one, and one of the hallucinations that he has will be the chosen extract, and then you think about this discussing how his guilt is presented, okay? And obviously, guys, remember that if you want to see how to structure your essays, right? Because now we're in the final few weeks of the in the run-up to the 2025 exams. You want to see how to, put together these questions and these essays that you've been practicing. Maybe you have questions, you're like, okay, I've been doing all of this practice. I'm not getting very much feedback from my teacher because they're too busy to go over my stuff here. How can I maybe get some kind of feedback? Just join in my Macbeth Masterclass. It's going to be on the 7th of April over Easter at 5 to 6 p.m. We're going to be going over how to write a model answer for the 2022 exam, because in my last Masterclass we went over 2023 and 2024. And of course, also with my predictions, I will also be guiding my students how and the points that they can talk about if they were to get a Macbeth or a guilt or even an ambition question. Okay?
Will there be a link in the description?
And of course there'll be a link in the description. Okay? So thanks so much, guys, for watching.